The morning sun cast long shadows across the military hospital's rehabilitation center as Sarah Chen limped through the entrance. Her left leg, wrapped in compression bandages from knee to ankle, made each step a deliberate effort. The young woman's face bore the quiet determination of someone who had learned to push through pain. But today felt different. Today, she was returning to the world outside the sterile walls that had been her home for 8 months. Sarah had been a rising star in the Army Corps of Engineers before the explosion. At 26, she was already leading complex infrastructure projects in conflict zones, earning respect from seasoned veterans twice her age. But one miscalculated step on a hidden improvised explosive device had changed everything. The blast had shattered her left leg in 3 places and left her with burns across her arms and shoulder. More devastating than the physical wounds, though, was the loss of her unit. 3 of her closest friends and colleagues hadn't made it home. The rehabilitation center buzzed with activity as she made her way to the physical therapy wing. Other wounded soldiers worked with therapists, their faces showing the same mix of determination and frustration that Sarah knew too well. Some were missing limbs. Others bore scars that told stories of battles fought far from home. Each person here carried invisible wounds that went deeper than what the eye could see. Dr. Martinez, her physical therapist, greeted her with the same encouraging smile she'd worn for months. "Ready for your final session before discharge, Sarah?" she asked, checking her clipboard. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure if ready was the right word. The outside world felt foreign now, full of people who couldn't understand what she'd been through. As Sarah began her exercises, she noticed a group of young men near the visitors area. They appeared to be college students, probably on some kind of educational tour. She'd seen similar groups before, wide-eyed civilians getting a glimpse into military life, most of them treating it like a field trip to a museum. Their whispered conversations and pointing fingers weren't unusual, but something about this group felt different. One of them, a tall young man with perfectly styled hair and expensive sneakers, seemed particularly interested in the wounded soldiers. He held his phone casually, occasionally taking photos when he thought no one was looking. His friends clustered around him, laughing at his whispered comments. Sarah tried to focus on her exercises, but their presence was becoming increasingly distracting. The physical therapy session was grueling as always. Sarah's leg had to be coaxed back to functionality through a series of painful exercises designed to restore strength and mobility. Each movement was a small victory against the damage the explosion had caused. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she worked through the routine, her jaw clenched against the discomfort. During a brief rest between sets, she overheard fragments of conversation from the visitor group. The young man with the phone was speaking louder now, his voice carrying across the room. "Look at that one," he said, gesturing in Sarah's direction. "Probably got hurt tripping over her own feet. These people always want sympathy for the stupidest things." Sarah's blood ran cold. She'd faced enemy fire, survived an explosion that killed her friends, and fought for months to regain the ability to walk. But somehow, this stranger's casual cruelty cut deeper than any physical wound. She continued her exercises, trying to block out his voice, but the comments kept coming. "I bet half of these people are just faking it for the benefits," the young man continued, his friends snickering along. "My dad says military people always exaggerate their injuries. Look how dramatic they're being with those bandages and limps. It's all for show." The other patients had noticed too. Sarah could see the hurt and anger in their faces. Men and women who had sacrificed everything for their country, now being mocked by someone who had clearly never faced a day of real hardship. Some of the staff members looked uncomfortable, but protocol prevented them from interfering with visitors unless they became directly disruptive. Sarah finished her session in silence, her usual sense of accomplishment overshadowed by the stranger's words. As she gathered her things, she could still hear him talking, his voice growing bolder with each comment. He was taking more photos now, no longer trying to hide his behavior. The worst part wasn't even the insults. It was the casual nature of them. This young man had no idea what any of these people had been through, yet he felt comfortable making judgments about their sacrifice and suffering. He represented everything wrong with how civilians sometimes viewed military service members. as either heroes to be pitied or frauds to be suspected, never as complex human beings who had simply done their job under impossible circumstances. As Sarah prepared to leave the rehabilitation center for the last time as a patient, she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was somehow significant. The young man's mockery had awakened something in her, not just anger, but a recognition that the battle for respect and understanding would continue long after her physical wounds had healed. She didn't know that across the room, seated quietly, in a corner chair, an elderly man in civilian clothes had been watching the entire exchange. His weathered hands gripped the arms of his chair tightly, and his eyes held the kind of intensity that comes from decades of command. General William Harrison had come to visit wounded soldiers as he did every month, but today's visit would be different from any other. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everyone present, though none of them knew it yet. The young man's name was Marcus Wellington, and he had never known a day of real struggle in his 22 years of life. Born into wealth and privilege, he attended an elite university where his biggest concerns were maintaining his social media image and choosing which luxury car to drive to weekend parties. His father was a prominent businessman who had strong opinions about military spending and what he considered government handouts to veterans. Marcus had come to the rehabilitation center as part of a political science course requirement. His professor had assigned students to observe different government institutions to write reports on public spending efficiency. Most students had chosen libraries or city halls, but Marcus thought a military hospital would provide more dramatic content for his social media followers. As the tour group moved through different sections of the facility, Marcus continued his running commentary. His phone captured everything, and he was already planning how to edit the footage for maximum impact online. In his mind, he was exposing what he saw as wasteful government spending on people who probably weren't as injured as they claimed. "Check this out," Marcus whispered to his closest friend Jake while recording a veteran struggling with prosthetic legs during physical therapy. "My dad was right about these people milking the system. Look how slowly that guy is moving. He's obviously playing it up for the cameras and sympathy." Jake shifted uncomfortably. Unlike Marcus, he came from a military family and understood the reality of combat injuries. But he'd learned long ago that challenging Marcus led to social isolation within their wealthy circle. "Maybe we should focus on the actual tour," he suggested weakly. Marcus dismissed the suggestion with a wave. "This is way more interesting than listening to some boring administrator talk about budget allocations. Besides, people need to see the truth about where their tax dollars are going." The tour guide, a young lieutenant who had been assigned to show the students around, tried to maintain professional composure despite growing discomfort with Marcus's behavior. She had seen many visitors over the years, and she could recognize disrespect when she saw it. However, her orders were clear: be courteous to all visitors and avoid confrontations that might reflect poorly on the facility. Sarah, meanwhile, had decided to stay a bit longer to say goodbye to some of the staff members who had helped her through her recovery. As she moved slowly through the corridors, she could still hear Marcus's voice echoing from different rooms. His comments were becoming more elaborate and cruel, as if he was performing for an invisible audience. "Look at this place," Marcus said, gesturing broadly at the state-of-the-art equipment and comfortable facilities. "They've got better workout equipment than my private gym. These people are living like kings on taxpayer money while complaining about their little cuts and bruises." Dr. Martinez, who was walking nearby, stopped abruptly. In her 15 years of treating wounded warriors, she had never encountered such blatant disrespect. Her professional training warred with her human decency as she watched this privileged young man mock people who had sacrificed everything for their country. The group moved into the prosthetics workshop, where specialists helped amputees adapt to artificial limbs. Here, Marcus's commentary reached new lows. "Now this is just ridiculous," he said, filming a veteran learning to use a high-tech prosthetic arm. "These things probably cost more than most people's cars. All because someone couldn't be careful enough to avoid stepping on a bomb. Natural selection, right?" His friends looked increasingly uncomfortable, but none had the courage to speak up. The social dynamics of their group made Marcus the unquestioned leader, and challenging him meant risking their own position in their exclusive circle. Unbeknownst to the tour group, their path was being closely observed by General William Harrison. At 73 years old, the retired four-star general had seen everything the military could offer, from the halls of the Pentagon to the dustiest outposts in Afghanistan. He had lost more soldiers under his command than he cared to count, and had spent countless hours visiting wounded warriors in facilities just like this one. General Harrison was dressed in simple civilian clothes, khakis and a button-down shirt that showed no indication of his rank or decorated career. His monthly visits to the rehabilitation center were personal, not official, and he preferred to blend in with other visitors. Today, however, his calm demeanor was being tested by Marcus's increasingly offensive behavior. The general had arrived early for his usual rounds, intending to spend time with soldiers he had visited before and meet new arrivals. Instead, he found himself witnessing a display of ignorance and cruelty that made his blood boil. Every comment from Marcus felt like a personal insult to the men and women he had commanded and the sacrifices they had made. As the tour group entered the traumatic brain injury ward, Marcus's behavior escalated further. Here, soldiers with invisible wounds worked to regain cognitive functions lost to explosions and impacts. The young man seemed to find their struggles particularly amusing. "Look at this guy," Marcus said, pointing at a veteran working with a speech therapist to regain his ability to form words after a severe head injury. "He's probably just pretending to be confused. I bet when the cameras are off, he talks perfectly fine. It's all an act to get disability payments." The speech therapist, a dedicated professional who had worked with brain injury patients for over a decade, felt tears of anger forming in her eyes. The veteran Marcus was mocking had been a brilliant engineer before his injury, a man who had saved dozens of lives by defusing explosive devices. Now he struggled to remember his own children's names some days. General Harrison had heard enough. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he watched this pampered young man mock heroes who had given everything for their country. The general's own grandson was currently serving overseas, and the thought of someone treating him with such disrespect if he ever got injured was unbearable. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose not just Marcus's ignorance, but also reveal truths about sacrifice, service, and respect that would change everyone's perspective. The general began moving purposefully toward the group, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes to those who knew how to recognize it. The rehabilitation center's main therapy room fell unusually quiet, as Marcus's voice grew louder and more confident. He had noticed that his comments were drawing attention from staff and patients alike, and he mistook their shocked silence for agreement with his views. In his privileged world, attention had always meant admiration, and he couldn't recognize the difference between being watched and being despised. Sarah had been making her way toward the exit when Marcus's latest round of insults reached her ears. She turned to see him standing near a group of amputees who were learning to walk with prosthetic legs. These were some of the bravest people she had ever known. Soldiers who had literally left pieces of themselves on foreign battlefields defending freedom for ungrateful people like Marcus. Seriously, though, Marcus continued, his phone still recording. How hard can it be to walk with fake legs? They're making it look impossible just to get sympathy. Back in my grandfather's day, people didn't complain this much about minor inconveniences. One of the amputees, a young Marine named David who had lost both legs below the knee to an improvised explosive device, stopped his exercises and looked directly at Marcus. The pain in his eyes wasn't from his missing limbs, it was from hearing his sacrifice dismissed as a minor inconvenience by someone who had clearly never faced real hardship. The tour guide lieutenant tried to intervene diplomatically. "Perhaps we should move to the next section," she suggested, hoping to redirect the group away from the therapy areas. But Marcus was enjoying himself too much to be deterred. "Actually, I want to get some more footage here," Marcus announced, moving closer to the patients. "My followers are going to love seeing how the government wastes money on these elaborate setups. Look at all this expensive equipment for people who probably got hurt doing something stupid in the first place." Dr. Martinez finally reached her breaking point. Despite her professional obligations, she couldn't stand by and watch her patients be humiliated any longer. "Excuse me," she said firmly, approaching Marcus. "I need to ask you to be more respectful. These individuals have made tremendous sacrifices for our country." Marcus looked at her with the same condescending smile he used when service workers tried to correct him. "Listen, lady, I'm just calling it like I see it. These people signed up for the military knowing the risks. Now they want us all to feel sorry for them when they face the consequences of their choices. It's called personal responsibility." The therapy room had gone completely silent now. Patients, staff members, and even Marcus's own classmates were staring in disbelief at his callous words. Sarah felt her hands shaking with anger, not just at Marcus's ignorance, but at his complete lack of empathy for human suffering. General Harrison had positioned himself where he could observe the entire scene. His trained eye took in every detail: the hurt expressions on the faces of wounded warriors, the growing discomfort of the staff, and the oblivious cruelty of the young man at the center of it all. The general had dealt with politicians, foreign dignitaries, and enemy commanders, but he had rarely encountered someone who disgusted him as much as Marcus did at this moment. "You know what the real problem is?" Marcus continued, warming to his theme as he addressed his phone camera like he was hosting his own talk show. "These people get hurt and immediately start thinking the world owes them something. They milk their injuries for all the sympathy and benefits they can get, instead of just moving on with their lives like normal people would." An elderly veteran, in a wheelchair who had lost his legs in Vietnam 50 years earlier, began to wheel himself toward Marcus. His face showed decades of pain and wisdom earned through unimaginable hardship. "Son," he said quietly, "you don't know what you're talking about." Marcus turned to face the older man with barely concealed irritation. "Oh great, here comes another sob story. Let me guess, you want to tell me about how tough you had it and how grateful I should be, right? Save it, Grandpa. I've heard it all before from my uncle who supposedly served in Iraq but probably just sat behind a desk the whole time." The veteran's eyes filled with tears, not from sadness but from a deep, burning anger that he had learned to control over 5 decades of civilian life. This young man was mocking not just him, but every friend he had lost, every brother in arms, who had never made it home, every family that had sacrificed their loved ones for freedom. Sarah couldn't stay silent anymore. Despite her physical limitations, she walked directly up to Marcus, her limp more pronounced now due to the emotional stress. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she said, her voice steady but filled with controlled fury. "These people have given everything for this country. They've earned the right to recover with dignity." Marcus looked her up and down dismissively, taking in her compression bandages and obvious mobility issues. "And what's your story? Let me guess. Another tragic victim who wants me to believe she's some kind of hero because she got a few scratches while playing soldier?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Several staff members moved closer, ready to intervene if the situation escalated further. The tour guide lieutenant reached for her radio, prepared to call security if necessary. Even Marcus's friends looked ready to distance themselves from him if his behavior got them in trouble. But before Sarah could respond, before security could be called, before anyone else could react, a calm but commanding voice cut through the tension like a blade. "That's enough." Everyone turned to see General Harrison stepping forward from where he had been observing silently. His civilian clothes couldn't hide the decades of command authority that radiated from his bearing. When he walked, it was with the confident stride of someone who had never doubted his right to be heard and obeyed. Marcus, still oblivious to who he was facing, rolled his eyes. "Great, another old guy wants to lecture me. Look, whatever your story is, I'm not interested. This is America. I have the right to express my opinions." The general stopped directly in front of Marcus, his steely gray eyes locking onto the young man's face with an intensity that had once made foreign ministers nervous. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had commanded thousands of soldiers and made life and death decisions that affected nations. "Young man, you are about to learn something very important about respect, sacrifice, and the true cost of the freedom you take for granted every day." Marcus looked at the elderly man in civilian clothes and let out a dismissive laugh. "Oh, please, spare me the patriotic lecture. Let me guess, you're another veteran who thinks his service makes him special? I've heard this speech from every old-timer who wants to play hero." General Harrison's expression didn't change, but those who knew him would have recognized the dangerous calm that settled over his features. It was the same composure he had shown while making decisions that affected thousands of lives. The same steady presence that had earned him respect from allies and enemies alike throughout his distinguished career. "You want to know about service, son?" the general asked quietly. "Let me tell you about the young woman you just mocked." He gestured toward Sarah, who stood frozen in surprise at the unexpected intervention. "Her name is Captain Sarah Chen, United States Army Corps of Engineers. She holds 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart." Marcus's smirk faltered slightly, but his arrogance kept him talking. "Anyone can buy fake medals online these days. Besides, what's a Bronze Star anyway? Probably just a participation trophy for showing up." The general's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Captain Chen earned her first Bronze Star for designing and constructing a water purification system that saved over 3,000 Afghan civilians from cholera. She earned her second for leading a team that cleared 17 improvised explosive devices from a school playground, allowing hundreds of children to return to their education safely. Sarah stared at the general in amazement. How did this stranger know the details of her service record? She had never seen him before, but he was recounting her military career with perfect accuracy. "The Purple Heart," General Harrison continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "She earned when she deliberately triggered an IED that would have killed a convoy of medical supplies heading to a children's hospital. She absorbed the blast herself, saving 23 medics and enough medicine to treat over 1,000 sick children." The room had gone completely silent. Even Marcus seemed momentarily speechless as the weight of these revelations sank in. But his privileged upbringing had taught him that admitting error was weakness, so he doubled down on his ignorance. "That's a nice story, but anyone can make up heroic tales. Where's the proof? I bet if I looked into it, I'd find out she was just a desk clerk who got hurt in some accident and made up all these dramatic stories to get better benefits." The general reached into his wallet and pulled out a photograph. It showed him in full dress uniform, standing next to several officers, including a younger Sarah Chen at an award ceremony. "This was taken at the Pentagon when I personally pinned Captain Chen's second Bronze Star to her uniform. I was the commanding general who approved her for that decoration after reviewing the detailed reports of her actions under fire." Marcus's face began to pale as he realized this wasn't just another angry veteran, but someone with actual authority and detailed knowledge. However, his pride wouldn't let him back down gracefully. "Okay, so maybe she did some good things," he said with forced casualness. "But that doesn't excuse all the whining and complaining about her injuries now. She knew the risks when she signed up. She doesn't deserve special treatment just because she got hurt doing her job." General Harrison's composure finally cracked, just slightly. Those closest to him could see the controlled fury building behind his eyes. The same righteous anger that had driven him through decades of fighting for his soldiers' welfare and recognition. "Special treatment?" the general repeated, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made career officers straighten their spines. "Do you know what Captain Chen's special treatment consists of? 8 months of agonizing physical therapy to regain the ability to walk. Nightmares about the friends who died in that explosion. Survivor's guilt that makes her question why she lived when better people didn't make it home." The general stepped closer to Marcus, his presence suddenly filling the room. "Her special treatment includes a partial disability that means she'll never again lead soldiers in combat, which was her greatest passion in life. It includes explaining to her parents why their daughter came home broken when they sent her away whole. It includes wondering every day if she'll ever be able to have children who can run and play with her normally." Marcus tried to maintain his defiant posture, but something in the general's bearing was making him nervous. This wasn't just another angry old man. This was someone who commanded respect through sheer force of character and experience. "And you, General Harrison," continued, his voice rising just enough to ensure everyone in the room could hear clearly, "you think she should just get over it and move on? You think the months of surgeries, the years of rehabilitation, the lifetime of managing chronic pain is somehow an acceptable price for defending your right to stand here and mock her sacrifice?" Dr. Martinez watched in amazement as this mysterious civilian systematically dismantled Marcus's cruel worldview with facts and moral authority. The other patients had stopped their exercises to listen, their faces showing a mixture of gratitude and vindication as someone finally stood up for them with the kind of credibility that couldn't be dismissed. Jake, Marcus's friend who came from a military family, finally found his courage. "Marcus, I think we should go," he said quietly. "You've said enough." But Marcus, trapped by his own arrogance and the presence of his phone camera, felt compelled to continue defending his position. "Look, I appreciate military service and all that, but we can't just give everyone a free pass forever because they got hurt. At some point, people need to take responsibility for their own lives and stop expecting handouts." The general's eyes narrowed to points of steel. "Handouts?" he repeated, his voice carrying the kind of deadly quiet that preceded storms. "Captain Chen isn't asking for handouts. She's recovering from wounds she received while saving lives. Every person in this room has paid a price in blood and sacrifice that you couldn't even begin to comprehend." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but the general wasn't finished. "But since you want to talk about responsibility and earning things, let me ask you a question, son. What exactly have you earned in your 22 years of life? What have you sacrificed for anyone other than yourself? What gives you the right to judge people who have given everything for their country while you've given nothing?" Marcus's face flushed red as the general's question hit home. For the first time in the encounter, he found himself speechless. His entire life had been built on privileges he had never earned, wealth inherited from family businesses he had never worked in, opportunities handed to him because of his last name, and respect he had never actually deserved. The general pressed his advantage, his voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had earned every word through decades of service and sacrifice. "You drive a car that costs more than most soldiers make in a year, don't you? You attend a university that charges more for one semester than many families earn annually. You wear clothes that cost more than the monthly disability check that barely covers the medical expenses of the heroes you're mocking." The room was so quiet that the only sounds were the hum of medical equipment and Marcus's increasingly labored breathing. His classmates had moved away from him, finally recognizing that his behavior was not just embarrassing, but morally reprehensible. "And what have you contributed to society in return for all those privileges?" the general continued. "Have you volunteered to help veterans? Have you donated to charities that support wounded warriors? Have you ever spent even one day of your comfortable life thinking about the sacrifices made by people like Captain Chen so that you could sleep safely in your privileged bubble?" Sarah watched in amazement as this unknown defender systematically exposed the hollow nature of Marcus's character. She had spent months wondering if civilians really understood what military personnel went through, and here was proof that some people not only understood but were willing to stand up and defend those who had served. Marcus tried to regain some composure. "You don't know anything about my life or what I've done," he said weakly, but his voice lacked the arrogant confidence it had carried just minutes earlier. "Don't I?" the general asked, reaching for his phone. "You've been broadcasting your ignorance and cruelty live on social media, haven't you? Let me show you something interesting." He held up his phone, which displayed Marcus's own social media profile. Marcus Wellington III, son of Wellington Industries CEO, private university, exclusive fraternity, spring breaks in Europe, summer homes in the Hamptons. Marcus's eyes widened in shock. How had this stranger accessed his personal information so quickly and thoroughly? "Funny thing about technology," the general continued with a slight smile. "It works both ways. While you've been filming these wounded heroes to mock them online, other people have been watching you. Your little performance today has been seen by quite a few folks who are very interested in your opinions about military service." The general's phone buzzed with notifications. "In fact, it looks like your video has already been shared several thousand times. People are very curious to learn more about the young man who thinks wounded veterans are faking their injuries for attention." Marcus grabbed for his own phone, frantically trying to delete his posts, but it was too late. The internet had already captured his cruel behavior, and the backlash was beginning. Comments were pouring in from veterans, military families, and outraged civilians who couldn't believe what they were seeing. "You want to know about consequences?" the general asked, his voice taking on an educational tone. "Captain Chen will spend the rest of her life dealing with the consequences of her Heroic actions, chronic pain, limited mobility, and survivor's guilt are her daily reality. But what consequences have you ever faced for your actions? Dr. Martinez and the other staff members watched in fascination as the general delivered what could only be described as a masterclass in moral authority. This unknown man was speaking for every veteran who had ever been dismissed or mocked by ungrateful civilians. Well, you're about to learn about consequences, the general continued. Your father's company does quite a bit of business with the Department of Defense, doesn't it? Government contracts, military supply chains, defense industry partnerships. I wonder how those relationships might be affected when his business partners learn that his son thinks wounded veterans are frauds and complainers. Marcus's face went white. His father's business empire was indeed heavily dependent on government contracts, and he was expected to join the company after graduation. The thought of damaging those relationships was terrifying. But here's the real tragedy, the general said, his voice softening slightly. You could have used your privilege and advantages to make a real difference in the world. Instead of mocking wounded veterans, you could have been supporting them. Instead of posting cruel videos for entertainment, you could have been raising awareness about the challenges they face. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes, not from sadness but from gratitude. This stranger was saying everything she had wanted to say, but couldn't find the words for. He was defending not just her, but every service member who had ever been misunderstood or misjudged by civilians. The saddest part, the general continued, is that you represent everything these heroes fought to protect. Your right to free speech, your ability to criticize the government, your freedom to live without fear of oppression. All of that exists because people like Captain Chen were willing to sacrifice their bodies and minds to preserve it. Marcus tried one last desperate defense. Look, maybe I said some things I shouldn't have, but you can't ruin my life over a few comments. It's not fair. The general's laugh was harsh and humorless. Fair? You want to talk about fair? Is it fair that Captain Chen will never run again because she saved the lives of people she had never met? Is it fair that the Marine over there will never feel sand between his toes because he stepped on a bomb meant for a school bus full of children? Is it fair that the veteran in the wheelchair has been dealing with his wounds for 50 years while you've been dealing with the hardship of choosing which sports car to drive? The general stepped back and looked around the room at all the wounded veterans who had been listening to the exchange. These people don't want your pity, son. They don't want your charity. They don't even want your gratitude, though they've earned it 1,000 times over. All they want is basic human respect and the dignity to recover from their wounds without being mocked by people who have never sacrificed anything more significant than sleep to study for an exam. Marcus stood there, surrounded by the evidence of his own cruelty and ignorance, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistakes. But the general wasn't finished with him yet. The rehabilitation center remained silent as the full weight of the confrontation settled over everyone present. Marcus stood frozen, his phone still in his hand but no longer recording, finally beginning to comprehend the enormity of his mistakes. The wounded veterans around him were no longer objects of his mockery, but real people whose sacrifices he was only just beginning to understand. General Harrison looked around the room at the faces watching him, medical staff who had dedicated their careers to healing wounded warriors, veterans who had given parts of themselves for their country, and students who were learning a lesson they would never forget. Now, the general said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in command, let me tell you who I am, since you seem to think credentials matter more than character. He reached into his wallet again and pulled out a military ID card. General William Harrison, United States Army, retired. 46 years of active service. 2 tours in Vietnam, 3 in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq. Marcus's remaining defiance crumbled completely as he realized he had been arguing with one of the highest-ranking officers in military history. I commanded the task force that Captain Chen served under during her final deployment, the general continued. I read every after-action report. I interviewed every survivor. I held the hands of dying soldiers and wrote letters to their families. I know exactly what these people have sacrificed because I was there when they made those sacrifices. Sarah stared at the general with new understanding. She remembered now General Harrison had been the commanding officer who had visited her in the field hospital after the explosion. He had been there when she woke up, confused and broken, asking about her lost teammates. He had been the one to tell her that she was going home, that her war was over. "General Harrison?" she said quietly, her voice barely audible. The general turned to her with a gentle smile that transformed his stern features. "Hello, Captain. It's good to see you up and moving around. How are you feeling?" I'm doing better, sir. I'm actually being discharged today, starting my transition to civilian life." The general nodded approvingly. "Outstanding. You've earned it." He turned back to Marcus, who was now visibly shaking with the realization of how badly he had misjudged the situation. "You see, son," the general said, his voice taking on a teaching tone, "Captain Chen is what we call a true warrior. Not because she enjoyed combat or sought out violence, but because she put the welfare of others above her own safety every single day. When that explosive device detonated, she had maybe 3 seconds to make a decision. She could have thrown herself clear and let the blast kill the medical convoy behind her, or she could sacrifice herself to save others." The general paused, letting the weight of that choice sink in. She chose to save others. She deliberately absorbed a blast that would have killed 23 medics and destroyed medical supplies meant for a children's hospital. That's not stupidity or carelessness. That's the kind of moral courage that most people never have to display in their entire lives. Dr. Martinez wiped tears from her eyes as she listened to the full story of her patient's injuries for the first time. She had worked with Sarah for months, helping her regain mobility and strength, but had never known the full heroic circumstances behind her wounds. Marcus looked around the room at the faces staring at him, no longer with curiosity or mild disapproval, but with genuine disgust and disappointment. His classmates had moved as far away from him as possible, clearly wanting no association with his behavior. The tour guide lieutenant was speaking quietly into her radio, undoubtedly reporting the incident to her superiors. "I didn't know," Marcus said weakly, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't understand what really happened." General Harrison's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "That's exactly the problem, son. You didn't know, but you spoke anyway. You made judgments about people's character and sacrifice without taking even a moment to learn their stories or understand their experiences." The general gestured toward the elderly veteran in the wheelchair who had tried to speak earlier. "Do you see that man over there? Master Sergeant Robert Murphy, recipient of the Medal of Honor. He lost his legs dragging wounded comrades out of a bunker that was under direct enemy fire in Vietnam. He saved 11 lives that day, and he's spent the last 50 years in that wheelchair without once complaining about his sacrifice." Marcus's phone buzzed repeatedly with notifications, but he ignored it. The social media storm he had created was growing by the minute, but that seemed insignificant compared to the shame he felt standing in front of these genuine heroes. "And that young woman over there," the general continued, pointing to a soldier working with prosthetic arms, "lost both hands defusing a bomb that was planted near a school in Afghanistan. She could have waited for the bomb disposal team, but children were playing just 50 yards away. She chose to risk everything rather than let innocent kids get hurt." The general walked slowly around the room, his voice carrying to every corner. "Every person in this facility has a story of sacrifice and service they didn't choose to get. Wounded, they chose to put themselves in harm's way to protect others. The wounds they carry are the price they paid for your freedom to stand here and express your ignorant opinions." Sarah felt a strength returning to her that she hadn't experienced since before her injury. Hearing the general defend her actions and explain the true circumstances of her wounds was healing something deep inside her that months of physical therapy hadn't been able to touch. "But here's what I want you to understand," the general said, turning back to Marcus. "This isn't really about you. Your ignorance and cruelty are symptoms of a larger problem in our society. Too many people like you have grown up so insulated from the reality of military service that you can't even recognize heroism when you see it." The general's phone rang and he glanced at the screen. "Excuse me," he said, answering the call. "Yes, this is General Harrison. Yes, I'm aware of the video. No, I don't think that will be necessary. Actually, I have a better idea." He hung up and looked directly at Marcus. That was the public affairs office at the Pentagon. Your little video has reached some very important people, and they're not happy. There's talk of launching an investigation into your father's defense contracts, possibly even criminal charges for harassment of wounded veterans. Marcus's face went pale. Please, he said desperately. I know I made a mistake. I'll delete everything. I'll apologize publicly. Just don't ruin my family's business. General Harrison studied the young man for a long moment, seeing not just an arrogant child, but perhaps someone who could still be saved from his own ignorance. Here's what's going to happen, he said finally. You're going to spend the next 6 months volunteering at veterans' facilities. Not for publicity, not for college credit, but to actually learn about the people you've been mocking, the generals. Voice carried the tone of someone issuing orders that would be followed. You're going to listen to their stories. You're going to help with their rehabilitation. You're going to understand what real sacrifice looks like. And maybe, just maybe, you'll become the kind of person worthy of the freedom they've preserved for you. Marcus nodded eagerly, grasping at this unexpected opportunity for redemption. Yes, sir. I'll do whatever you want. I'll make this right. This isn't about what I want, the general replied. This is about what you owe to these people and to your country. The question is whether you're man enough to pay that debt. Sarah stepped forward, her limp barely noticeable now as purpose and dignity straightened her spine. General, if I may, she said, I'd like to be part of his education. I think Marcus here needs to understand not just what happened to me, but why it was worth it. The general smiled with genuine pride. Captain, I think that's an excellent idea. Nothing would serve this young man better than learning about honor from someone who truly embodies it. As the confrontation came to an end, the rehabilitation center began to return to its normal rhythm. Patients resumed their exercises. Staff members went back to their duties, and Marcus's classmates quietly departed, leaving him to face the consequences of his actions alone. But something fundamental had changed in that room. The wounded veterans stood a little taller, validated by having their sacrifices acknowledged and defended. The staff felt renewed pride in their mission of healing heroes, and Marcus, for the first time in his privileged life, began to understand the difference between being entitled and being worthy. General Harrison approached Sarah one final time before leaving. Captain, he said quietly, you've served your country with distinction and honor. Now comes the hardest part. Learning to serve yourself with the same dedication. Take care of that leg, but more importantly, take care of that warrior spirit. The world needs more people like you. As Sarah watched the general leave, she realized that her real recovery wasn't just about regaining the ability to walk. It was about reclaiming her sense of worth and purpose, understanding that her sacrifices had meaning, and knowing that there were still people in the world who recognized the difference between heroes and those who merely benefit from their heroism. The confrontation with Marcus had been painful, but it had also been exactly what she needed to remember who she was and what she had accomplished. The wounds might never fully heal, but the spirit that had driven her to save lives at the cost of her own body remained unbroken, and that was what truly mattered.